Wonderful. Great. Okay. So here we go. So I was going to say good afternoon, everyone, but I'll say good afternoon, Andrew. And thanks for joining us today. And we're going to explore GDPR and the life cycle of data. So this session, I'm aiming to simplify concepts of data minimization, backups, and archiving, and help you establish a clear and actionable life cycle for your organization's data. And for all those who are watching the recording, obviously you'll be able to watch this. And if you have any questions, then please do email me. Obviously, Andrew has the benefit of being here live and can ask these questions live once we've done the presentation. So let me share my screen, and then we will be ready to rock and roll. Okay, so GDPR and the life cycle of data. Hopefully you should be able to see the screen now, I think. So what we're going to talk about today is going to talk about the data life cycle, why data minimization is crucial, the arguments for backup against archiving and what the differences are and why, establishing your data life cycle. There are a few practical tools and tips. We're going to look at some challenges and solutions, and then we should have time for Q&A. So what is the data life cycle? Basically, for GDPR purposes and for most people's processing purposes, it's this. It's you have a collection stage at which you collect all the data, and of course that might happen at various points during the lifetime of the data. Then you've got the actual usage of the data. Then you're storing the data either to continue using it or just to store it so that you've got it for access. Then you're sharing the data or sharing results from the data. And then finally, you're disposing of the data, and it's that disposal bit as well, which is very, very important. We covered that in a previous forum. So why is data minimization crucial? Well, because if you imagine this being a load of data, then the minimization of the data means fewer risks and lower costs. Storage is still a cost, although it is a lot cheaper than it used to be, that's for sure. And it's much easier than it was. I mean, I remember not that long ago when a 1 terabyte drive would be the size of a double wardrobe, and now it's the size of a matchbox. So space is becoming less of an issue, but the more data you have, the more chance there is of something going wrong with it, the more chance there is of it being corrupted, or the more chance there is, if there's a breach, that people are going to steal more data that has more value. And so the less data you can keep, the fewer risks there are, and as I say, the lower costs there are, not both in physically in storage, but actually in processing it. And of course, there is actually a legal requirement under GDPR that for data minimization that says you should only hold data which you have a current use for. Now, current can be one of those words which lawyers can throw around for years as to what current actually means. But generally, I would say if you looked at a screen for the data and you said to everyone in your organization, why do we hold that particular field of information? And if no one knows an answer, then you probably shouldn't be holding it. Because someone somewhere should know what it's for. Likewise, I came across an example quite recently of a organization within their sales database. They had several years ago held a pro-am golf tournament and invited their clients along. And one of the fields on their CRM, their customer relationship management system, stored the score, the number of shots they'd gone round in this golf tournament. And I'm like, okay, that was probably useful on the day. Yeah. Current use for that, I think that's a tough one to argue. And if you get those situations, really, you ought to be deleting that data and just not holding it anymore. So then, of course, part of the life cycle of data is backing it up, because a little known thing with GDPR is about that backing up your data is actually a requirement that you keep a secure backup of the data. But what's the difference between backup and archiving? Well, backup is a safety net Backup is there, that if you want to restore data that because there's been a problem with the system, then you can. Archive is more about longer term storage. It might be data that you still need to hold, but you don't actually need access to on a day-by-day basis. And so you might well be storing that on, not on a physical device. It might be actually on a backup device, or if it's paper, it might be being held in an archive store somewhere. And then might well be off-site. And of course, the important thing with backups is to make sure that they are taken or done off-site, because a backup that's on-site is not a lot of use if your building catches fire. And so, it's always worth thinking about what's happening with those backups. Where do they go? And are you sure you know where they go? Because I came across an organization not that many long ago now, who were doing great backups. They were doing a backup every night onto a drive. Great. Manager was taking it in turns to take that drive home. But a good number of them, when they took it home, were just leaving it in the boot of their car till the next morning, which is actually not that secure. Someone steals that car, you've got a bit of a data breach problem. So the importance of backups and archiving, of course, is to keep that data secure. But archives in particular, do make sure that periodically, and probably every year or so, you have a look at the archives. A, to make sure that you're not keeping anything in the archive that you actually don't need to keep anymore. That's proviso number one. But proviso number two is, can you actually still restore it? Because my guess is there are probably a good number of organizations, and some of them might even be watching this, who have dropped backups from a few years ago that are on 3.5-inch floppies, or maybe 5.25-inch floppies, or maybe even 8-inch floppies. Well, if you've got an 8-inch floppy or a 5.25-inch floppy in particular, good luck trying to find a drive that can read it that's going to work with modern hardware. And the same is probably true even of a 3.5-inch floppy. And the same, same true even with CDs. I mean, I can remember when CDs first came out, they were seen as the ideal archive device because they would last forever. Yeah, not quite. It really depends, of course, how that's been stored and kept in that time. And so it is worth making sure, that you pick a few archives, and can you actually restore them? Have you actually still got the software to restore them? Because that's often the other issue as well, is if you pull that data off, but in fact no one can decrypt it to understand it, to know what it is, what's the point? And as I say, one of the things as well with backups is that if you have a backup and you can't restore it, you actually have a data breach. And that data breach should be recorded in your data breach register. And depending on the number of people it affects and what's on that data, you might even need to report it to the ICO. And so, it is important to make sure that your backups work, because most of us, and hey, I'll put my own hand up here. I don't check it probably as often as I should. But we do a backup every night, and that happens, or we do it automatically. I mean, mine set up to automatically back up to a location in the cloud overnight. How often do I check that backup actually works? Probably not that often, probably not often enough, if I'm honest. And so it is a question of making sure that works. And then we come down to data lifestyle and establishing the data lifecycle in your organization. And the first thing to do when you're establishing your data lifecycle is establish what data you've actually got, because you don't know what you have. You never know anything about what you haven't got. And lots of times, of course, you don't know about what you have got. And it is about actually making sure that you sit down department by department and say, what data do you actually keep? And I've highlighted this in a forum a few weeks ago, but my personal experience is one of the things that has got worse since the end of COVID and people coming back into the office, particularly people coming back in the office where it's hybrid, well, especially where it's hybrid working, is when everybody's working in the office, everything's sort of nice and centrally controlled. When people were working at home all the time, most organizations where it was a lot of personal data set up a VPN or whatever so that people were accessing the data securely, but the data was still centrally in the office. The danger now people are hybrid working is somebody's working on something, they think, oh, I'm working at home tomorrow, it's Friday, I'm working home tomorrow. I could finish that at home. I know, I'll stick it on the USB key and take it home on my laptop. And then they bring it back on the Monday, having done the work, and they copy it back. But what they don't do is delete that copy of the data that's on their laptop off of the laptop. And suddenly you've got 10 copies of data floating around that no one actually knows exists. And you don't want the first time you know they exist to be when there's a problem with them. So doing regular data inventories is a good step. And then it's about classifying that data because, what is, for want of a better term, normal data, normal personally identifiable information. What is sensitive data? What is medical data? What is financial data? Classifying that data so that you know where the risk areas are. And then also making sure, and we covered this in the last forum, is making sure about retention periods, that you've got set retention periods for data. So excuse me, my voice is down. How long you keep different types of data. And as we said last time, you can actually keep data for however long you want to. The important thing is that you've sat down and you've made a conscious decision as a group, or if you're a one-man band, that you've made a decision and you've documented it. If you're a company that you've documented it, you've made a decision, you've documented that decision, and you've documented not only how long you keep that sort of data, but why. And the test I always say to people to put on that is if you've made a decision that you're going to keep the data for 10 years and you've got your reason why, if you'd be prepared to say that reason why and add the words your honor on the end, then it's probably a valid reason. If you're not prepared to say your honor on the end, maybe you ought to have a think again about whether that's the right length of time to keep that data. I mean, I gave an example last time of a professional football club that I work with, and they keep their player data for 100 years. And they've made a conscious decision and a board decision. That's what they're going to do. And they've justified it in terms of historical interest and so on. And I'm content with their reason why they wanted to keep that for 100 years. But if you're just an average organization, you say, I want to keep our sales prospects for 100 years, bit of a hard one to justify that. Once you've done all that, you create your policies because, again, so much my common experience with GDPR working across many organizations is that an awful lot of organizations are doing it right. A lot of the time they don't realize that they are, and B, even if they do realize they are, if you ask to see their policy as to why they've made that decision or how that works, they can't show it to you. They don't know where it is. So create your policies, put them somewhere. And yeah, I mean, things like your data breach policy, hopefully you've got a good data breach policy, you put it up on the shelf, you never pull it down again. But knowing it's on the shelf is the important bit. So create your policies about the data life cycle, why you're keeping things as long as they are, what happens to them, what happens to that data, and how do you get rid of it, and how are you sure it's been got rid of? How are you sure it's been destroyed? A lot. I was talking to somebody recently who said, "Oh, it's all right because when we finish with, well, when we got hardware that we finish with, we send the hard drive off to a company and they send it back with a piece of paper saying they've deleted all the data off there." And I'm like, "So do you sell the drive then?" Well, sometimes. You know what? Unless it's worth an awful lot of money, my best advice to people with a hard drive is whack it with a hammer, and if it's still solid, whack it with a bigger hammer. Because that's the best way of making sure that no one can access the data that's on it. But then once you've got your policies, the important thing as well is put them into practice and prove that you have. You know, I deliberately don't make these forms a sales pitch, but people like myself are able to audit and make sure that you are putting things into practice. So then, practical tools and tips. first of all, and we talked about this a couple of forums ago, is get some data mapping software so that you can map out the data that you have, where it goes, how it flows, how it works. Make sure your staff training is up to date. It frightens me. I think a number of people watching this know that last week I was at the business show at London Excel with promoting our company. I was absolutely staggered by the number of people who came up to the stand and said, "What does GDPR mean?" And I'm like, considering it's now been around for 6 years, then where have you been? And I'd like to say all those people who did that were just small one-man companies, but they weren't. One person, who I won't name because I won't embarrass him, was a finance director for a £3 million company. And that he did not know what GDPR meant. I just found absolutely staggering. So it goes to show that there is still a big need for staff training. And also, if your staff last had training in 2018, it's probably time for them to have some refresher training because, would you still drive your car if its MOT certificate was dated 2018? You probably wouldn't. You'd probably think, I want to get that in the garage to make sure it's okay. So, get your staff trained. And the same with lifecycle management of data is making sure you got your policy. You said you don't delete it at such and such time. Make sure you've got something in place that it can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. Lifecycle management it doesn't have to be complicated, but does say when that data is going to be checked, who last checked it, and who deleted the data. So some challenges and solutions. My experience with data lifecycle management is start small. Pick one department or one team, get it all working with them, refine the process, and then scale it up. It's much, much easier than trying to do the whole organization in one fell swoop because you won't do it. Because as human beings, human beings are great, but a lot of us are resistant to change. And it's much easier to make that change one step at a time than it is to try and leap the steps, because ultimately someone ended up getting hurt, then it doesn't work. So a quick case study. This is a retail company that I did some work with. They sell luxury goods online. They hold lots of data, and we worked through with them to look at their data life cycle. Their data life cycle was actually quite good, except it didn't have to destroy the data bit at the end. They just kept data forever and a day. So they could tell you, what somebody bought 10 years ago. Do you really want to know that? Do you need to know that? You might need to know how many of a particular handbag you sold 10 years ago or last year or 3 years ago. But do you need to know who actually bought them? Well, it's more than 3 years ago. That becomes a harder argument to have. But we did a lot of work with them and came up with some great policies. And they now have a much slicker process for dealing with that. And by their own admission as well, a much slicker organization that we uncovered things in the whole way of looking at the data and how they were processing the data and the whole life cycle of the data, which didn't just make them GDPR compliant, although of course from my perspective that's important, but it actually made their business more efficient as well, because they weren't having this lumbering mass of data that they were sitting there that actually no one was quite sure what to do with. And I discovered like files and files and files on their systems, which no one knew why they were keeping them. A lot of the files I'm convinced no one even knew were there until we started looking. And so it is a case of, trim it down, because the less you hold, the easier things are. And also, of course, the easier it is as well that if someone makes a data subject access request to request what data you have about them, the less data you've got, the less time it takes to satisfy that request. Whereas if you've got lots and lots of data, you can spend hours and hours or days and days trying to satisfy that request. A quick heads up, actually, whilst I'm talking about that. The new Labour government is bringing through a new data bill, which they are just starting to push through Parliament. one good thing about that from company's perspective is that it will remove the right of a data subject to simply go to a company, I want to see everything you hold about me. So actually, I think that's a real positive move. I think that people are going to have to be more precise about what they want to see. Is A, going to save time, but B, is actually also going to make things better for everyone. And particularly small business, because small business suffer, I think, at the moment, trying to satisfy data subject access requests. So I'd gladly take any questions. My details will be coming up on the screen any second. And I do just also want to say that I will be putting a link into the chat. Let me stop sharing. I'll put a link into the chat for my diary, because if anyone wants to arrange a virtual coffee and chat further about their issues, I'll be very happy to talk to them about that. So I will put that link now in the chat so that everybody with the recording will get the link. And yeah, and Andrew, over to you if you have any questions.
To be honest, no, it's been very comprehensive. Like to think I'm all over GDPR, at least I know what it stands for, so that's always good. So no, I think there was things in there that was good to recap, but no specific questions at this stage.
Excellent. Okay. So in that case, I will wind up this episode of the forum. So if we can stop recording, Dorcas.